we are struggling with a lot of the narratives about men and men's sexuality, that men are dogs, men are pigs, men only want one thing.
Yeah.
And we want to be good men. And it puts us in a position of hiding from ourselves our own sexual desire, sometimes our kink desire, our novelty seeking, the things that we might know turn us on in porn. We don't want to share with our partners because we're afraid that they will think it's gross or demeaning or unfeminist. And we hide
hmm
that from ourselves. We
Or
hide that
gay.
from our partners. Right, or gay, if we like prostate stimulation, even if we're totally heterosexual. Those are pleasure centers. And all of that stuff puts us in a position where just even being honest with ourselves first, before we even think about being honest with a partner, it can be so challenging. We have a lot of
Yeah.
our own trauma under patriarchy and in relationship to other men to uncover before we can free our sexuality for ourselves and with our partners.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift.
Some of my very favorite nonfiction books throughout life were those that were written by therapists. That is, healing and helping professionals who have shared a unique framework or insight in a book that went on to permanently change the way I understand myself and improve my ability to relate to the world around me in healthier ways. Maybe you have books like this on your lifelong top 10 list too. My guest today is a person whose book, I believe, has the potential to bring profound healing to our society. Its topic is courageous and challenging, and his approach to it is both compassionate and practical. Eric FitzMedrud is a therapist specializing in relationship and sexual issues, specifically in helping men improve their sex lives by learning to regulate their emotions, removing sexual entitlement, and honing their sexual consent and negotiation skills. Eric is a speaker, a trainer of other therapists, and a teacher of graduate courses in psychology, also with a PhD in clinical psychology. His book is The Better Man, a guide to consent, stronger relationships, and hotter sex. And I'm proud to say that it was published in September by my company, Wonderwell. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation because this is a topic that I just think that we don't understand well enough. We don't talk about enough. And maybe that's because we don't really know how to talk about it. So I really think that that your book, The Better Man, is just going to add so much to the public conversation. And today we're going to dive into some of those topics. First of all, let me just ask you, I'm interested in this part of the subtitle. We know that consent is a respectful way to engage with a partner. I think that we see this as something that is ethical and good for us to do. And I suppose, not hard to see how that could lead to stronger relationships, but what does it have to do with hotter sex?
Yeah, a lot of our conversations around consent really seem to focus on fear and what I call low bar consent, preventing sexual assault, preventing consent violations. But consent is a tool that can carry us all the way from, of course, crossing that minimum bar, but all the way into the greatest sexual pleasure that's possible. People who are kinky like me use consent to explore our fantasies, to try new things, to open up, new ideas and new vistas and novelty in our relationships. Consent can be the avenue that helps us learn what will give and help us receive the greatest pleasure.
Hmm. That is so that's so sort of expansive, I suppose. And when you think about it that way, just feels so much clearer as a part of a not just a functional or healthy or appropriate relationship, but really like a joyful and fully expressed relationship. You mentioned kink there for a second, and so
Yes.
I'm a queer person myself. I've had relationships with both men and women, and I feel like that gives me a sensitivity and empathy for both the male and female experience. And I'm using that terminology deliberately, not necessarily to talk about men and women, but like a masculine and feminine experience in the bedroom. And I know how complex those gender roles can be, and the identity piece that we bring into our relationships, and how that identity can impact how we show up with a partner. So I know that is something that you and I share. Can you share with us how you identify?
Sure. So I'm also bisexual and polyamorous. I have not had as many sexual relationships with men, although I have had some. And yeah, it absolutely reframes my experience to have been a man playing and being sexual with a man. And, a man who's larger than me physically, a man who's more muscular and stronger than me. And it reframes my experience of my own power and just physicality in relationship with partners, even when it's other men who are smaller than me. And I think that
That's really interesting.
it has also really reframed my understanding of how consent is for everyone in the process. It's for the dominant partner, not just the submissive partner. It's for the high desire partner as well as the low desire partner. It's for men and women in whatever kind of
And
relationship
when you
they're
say
in. And
for them, you don't just mean sort of for them to be concerned about. You mean for their benefit. I think.
yes,
Tell
for
me where
their
I'm wrong.
benefit, for their protection. It's easy for us to get into
Mhm.
the idea that consent is just to protect the least privileged or the most vulnerable partner in a sexual relationship. But consent is there to
Mm.
protect everyone. It's there to protect our hearts. It's there to protect our fantasies and our desires as we share them. It's there to make sure that we're getting out of the sexual experience what we would like to get out of, and to give us an opportunity, if it looks like we're not going to get out of it what we want, to opt out.
Right. I'm thinking as you're talking about these dynamics, larger, smaller, more vulnerable, less vulnerable, all of these things. I'm thinking about how consent, in some ways, it has some things in common. Well, it's about honesty. It really connects to honesty and transparency about your preferences, about your experience, about what you do and don't like, what you do and don't want. And I'm reflecting on the fact that I don't have the statistic in front of me, but it's some really shocking number, like, I don't know, 60 or 70% of women or something faking orgasms in bed when with a male partner. And I'm thinking about just the level of sort of deception is maybe too strong a word, but sort of self-abandonment, I guess, and abandonment of one's own, uh, you know, pleasure imperative, and how if we were to really fold mutual expressions of consent into all of our sexual activity, that number would probably go down, not just because it's like some kind of like aggressive factor, but just because people are talking about what they like and what they want.
Right. The statistics that you're referring to are also really revealing, because those statistics about faking orgasm by women are vastly, vastly different for women in relationship with other women. So really that shows up
Oh, I
not just
know.
as, yeah, yeah, yeah. And a lot of the
Yeah,
process
Jesus.
is
Yeah.
as if we needed more. That process really emerges, I think, to protect men's egos in heterosexual relationships. And if men really had, what Laurie Mintz calls clitoracy, um, to really understand the nature of female pleasure with our partners, we would understand there are different processes. Penetration isn't likely to create orgasm for most of our female partners. We would understand this isn't about our ego. This isn't about us. This is about our unique partners, unique pleasure processes. And, you called it honesty. I also like to, I love that. And I talk about that a lot, but I also like to talk about just coming into alignment with nature instead of bringing in our
Mhm.
expectations about how things should be. If we come into acceptance of reality as it is, then we get to work with it and be more skillful with it.
Right. And I think that what that calls on both, or let's say all people in the sexual encounter, if there are more than two, what that calls on us all to do is to, you know, get comfortable with being seen as we are and being
Mhm,
known for who we are, and
mhm,
also getting
mhm.
comfortable with receiving our partner's truth about who they are. And that's really not something that traditionally is baked into our sort of gendered sexual or relations.
And for men, a big challenge in that process is that we are struggling with a lot of the narratives about men and men's sexuality, that men are dogs, men are pigs, men only want one thing.
Yeah.
And we want to be good men. And it puts us in a position of hiding from ourselves our own sexual desire, sometimes our kink desire, our novelty seeking, the things that we might know turn us on in porn. We don't want to share with our partners because we're afraid that they will think it's gross or demeaning or unfeminist. And we hide
Hmm.
that from ourselves. We
Or
hide that
gay.
from our partners. Right, or gay, if we like prostate stimulation, anal pleasure, even if we're totally heterosexual, those are pleasure centers.
Mhm.
And all of that
Mhm.
stuff puts us in a position where just even being honest with ourselves first, before we even think about being honest with a partner, it can be so challenging. We have a lot of
Yeah.
our own trauma under patriarchy and in relationship to other men to uncover before we can free our sexuality for ourselves and with our partners.
I love that you're, taking this really sort of compassionate healing approach to it, and so much empathy for men's experience. Because what really stands out for me in your book, one of the I think maybe lesser expected elements is that you write quite a bit about. It's not just about men as aggressors. It's you work quite a lot in your clinical work too, with men who need help accessing their pleasure and recovering perhaps from the shame-based conditioning around their desire, right? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the image that men get about what a good lover is a man whose penis is erect as soon as he wants it to be, available for penetrating his partners in whatever way they want. And we end up grappling with the hydraulics of our bodies if we're penis owning men, and whether that's responding the ways that we think it should, as well as our orgasmic response, too soon, too fast, comparing it to, the performers in pornography who, we didn't see them pop the Viagra before. We didn't see that actually that man's orgasm came in the first 5 minutes of that porn shoot, and then his Viagra allowed him to get the erection back, and then they shot the remaining 28 minutes. There's so many of these expectations that we have about our bodies, about our desire, that we should be performing masculinity, manhood, especially below the waist for our partners. And it gets in our way of showing up with all of the other ways we can receive pleasure and all of the other ways that we can give pleasure.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And then there's the kind of like embarrassment around like how much lust I have or how little lust I have in a moment, or those things too. And you talked about the issues around or the anxieties that men have around coming too soon, but also what about when orgasms are elusive and it's like, you know what, I'm not going to
Absolutely.
finish, and the sort of like embarrassment or shyness around that, feeling like I had no money shot. And
Uh,
so I think that we could all, like, women are used to that, right? Like, I can't come.
right.
It's awkward, but we're so used to it. Whereas I think for men, what I have observed anyway is that sometimes there's a little shame around that.
Reframing the idea of what makes a sexual experience complete can free us
Right.
from this sense that we have to give our partner an orgasm, which often ends up in, subtly creating pressure for our partner, which then, of course, makes their orgasm more elusive, but also that we have to perform orgasm for our partner. Our partners
Hmm.
can also have this idea that every man orgasms every encounter. And if he doesn't, something's wrong, or I haven't been desirable, passionate, sexual, attractive enough. And we need to free ourselves from the idea that we have to soothe that pain in our partner. But we have to also accept our nature is something our partners might need to grapple with, including the ways that might challenge them to set their expectations of us aside.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Well, talk to me for a moment too about entitlement and the social conditioning
Yeah,
that men can sometimes bring into their sexual partnerships that that weighs on them as well as on their partner. How does entitlement work
yeah.
to disrupt harmony in the bedroom?
Well, in my therapeutic practice, before I ever use the word entitlement, I always start with men's love and devotion. And I try to identify these are the ways you are trying to deliver that love and devotion to your partner. You are, I'm just going to use kind of an extreme example of a man who might be toiling under the idea that his work and his labor to provide is the thing that his partner needs from him. So he's working 80 hours a week in Silicon Valley, not at all an unusual experience. And he's pouring himself out, emptying all of his capacities, all of his emotional energy. He's drained, he's emotionally and mentally exhausted. And the center of my practice is the San Francisco Bay Area. These are a lot of liberal men who are not thinking, I am sexually entitled, right? Who consciously, most of them are feminists. And
Hmm.
when they pour themselves out, when they drain their capacities with work or other forms of labor for their partners, there's this thing that we can get into where we believe that because I have delivered my love in the only ways I know how, the contract is you will love me for that. And you will deliver that love in the ways that I need or expect. And if our aperture for receiving love is narrowed down to only being able to receive and feel loved when we have sex, this process of pouring ourselves out for our partners, because that's what we think is expected of us and what they really want and need, creates this unconscious form of sexual entitlement where now I want to be loved. I've poured myself out. I've committed to you. I've closed off all of these things. I've poured myself out. And most of the men, when we finally get to that point, are shocked to witness that entitlement has crept in unconsciously. And then it dovetails and gets
Wow.
reinforced by a lot of that cultural conditioning. And I really try to bring in so much compassion for the shock at witnessing it in yourself. You didn't choose it. You didn't create it. It was the two-dimensional confines of traditional masculinity and the pressures of capitalism that have put you into a position where you felt your worth was only through work and pouring yourself out, sacrificing your body. And that unconsciously reinforced the capacities for you to believe you're entitled to love in a certain way.
Eric, that is so interesting. Have never understood it that way before, and it makes so much sense. And what a more compassionate and nuanced way to think about entitlement, outside of this demonizing construct that is so prevalent. And, I
Right.
got to say, given historical sort of male female dynamics, not unwarranted, right? But to look at it from inside the perspective of the person who is um, trying to navigate a whole set of impulses, including very generous ones. And it
Yes.
occurs to me that along with this feeling of like, well, I am expressing my love through working 80 hours at my job. The sort of the other side of the coin to that is what you described about not feeling or expecting that the receiving of love is going to always only come through a sexual act, that I can't feel comfortable receiving love and or being vulnerable other than in a sexual moment. And that's the other side of it, right? Is that if I as a man, I'm not feeling safe to come home to my say female partner in this case and say, I am exhausted. I'm scared I'm going to get fired. The company is in trouble. I can't get off this hamster wheel. I feel like I owe this to the whole family and I'm just trapped in a life that I didn't choose, blah, 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 whatever, 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 and really lean into her for emotional support. Unable to
Right.
do that. It's just like, let's fuck, you know?
You're right. All of that vulnerability ends up getting hidden inside. I walk in the door and I may not feel safe to let all of that down. I may feel that if I'm vulnerable, I'm weak, I'm less manly, I'm not living up to things, I'm going to create fear in my family. And also, I am afraid and scared and need support from my community. How can I get that in a way that's sanctioned in the narrow confines of traditional masculinity? I can want to fuck and I can ask for
Yeah.
that. I can try to initiate that. That's allowed. And so that normal, humane, acceptable need for love, support, encouragement, and reassurance of my value comes out sideways in let me initiate sex because maybe that will give me those things, but it's the only way that I know how to do it.
And if it's the only way that that particular man in this case that feels able to receive it, and it happens to be that his female partner or any gendered partner at that time is like, you know what, it's not a good moment for me. I also had a stressful day. Then I guess
Yeah.
that it naturally follows that that should be received as a wholesale rejection of his work.
That feeling of rejection is powerful, and the interpretations of it can collapse us, kick our legs out from under us so rapidly
Mhm.
because there's so many complex things that are difficult to navigate in that situation, right? We often feel compounded by the grief and vulnerability in our partner. We should be strong for them. It's either I am going to be down.
Mm.
Maybe I can receive love and care, but if I can't, then I have to be there for the other person. We get these either or notions in our mind instead of, wow, how could we just hold hands and be exhausted on the couch together? How can we accept and
Yeah.
acknowledge and put the blame and responsibility on the external factors that have drained us both of a capacity to show up for each other?
Mhm.
But how can we be a team in that
Mhm.
grief, accepting that grief, but not needing to fix it for either of us? And,
Yeah, I
you
love
know,
that.
if,
Wow.
if we can open up that capacity to grieve, we can realize that impulse emotionally to perceive or interpret that decline to offer as a rejection of me, my sex forever, sex constantly, whatever it is not what's actually happening here.
Right. Right. I feel like we could talk for 5 hours about the content of the book and the nature of the
Yes.
work, but I want to talk. Let's sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about, in a broader sense, about you and your journey in this, in doing this work in the world. I would love to know, what led you to this specialism as a therapist, and why does this work matter to you on a personal level?
Yeah. I mean, I think, let me start before there was ever a book in mind. There's a personal thread of development as I
Yeah.
worked to incorporate um, and integrate my typically high desire sexuality, my polyamorous nature, my bisexuality, and trying to figure out how am I going to do this in my own relationship? And I want to acknowledge I didn't always do this well. I didn't always do this skillfully. So in my coursework as a graduate student, I wanted to take classes on sexuality, partly because I was trying to figure out how to integrate and make sense of my own sexuality and what would make it healthy. And that journey of figuring out, gosh, how am I going to acknowledge and repair in my relationship my own experiences of being unfaithful and cheating on my partner led me to being more compassionate and more skillful in helping couples recover from infidelity. My experiences of
Mm-hmm.
grappling with my high desire helped me be more compassionate with high desire partners of any gender, but also men. And that
Mm-hmm.
process has kind of led me, as often is the case for therapists, I did have to do this work on my own. And it created some of the skills that I have as a therapist for serving people with similar challenges. And
Mm-hmm.
then, kind of culturally, as the Me Too movement was reaching its firestorm levels on social media in late 2017, I was sitting in my office constantly witnessing not the predatory consent violations that are made most of the headlines, but the kinds of sexual pressure and more unintended consent violations that creep into our culture and to our individual experiences when we haven't been taught how to navigate consent. And so continuously seeing this going, okay, what's my in here? There's something going on broadly culturally, and there's a way that it touches on what's happening in my office. And it wasn't until the Aziz Ansari, if listeners remember
Oh,
that
yeah. I
story,
remember
the
that.
Aziz Ansari story came out, and I was like, this is much closer to what I see in my office. This kind of process of, like, at a certain level, he was engaging in this process of, like, okay, no problem. I'll back off. I'll acknowledge that the no has been given and I'll try to play it cool. And then not knowing how to manage his desire after that and not knowing how to really engage in a consent-oriented process of, like, hey, it seems like you're engaging sexually again, but I don't know if that means that you're interested in escalating again or not. That was where I started seeing,
Right.
like,
Right.
I've got an in. And I started writing a blog post because I was writing a blog at the time. And that one blog post became 2 and then 4 and then 8. And I was like, oh no, I think I had like 16,000 words at that point, and I realized I was writing a book, and
I was like, oh, oops, oops, looks like I have a lot to say here.
well, I realized that there was an entire developmental process that I was talking about, that there was a comprehensive educational gap that I was trying to fill in understanding testosterone, manhood, consent, but also emotions, communication, the nature of relationships, and the nature of desire. As just when I hit that point and I realized I was writing a book, I actually got really scared and I didn't touch it for about 4 months. I talked about it some, but I just backed away. I was like,
Uh-huh.
I don't know that I want to write this book. This book is asking me to write it, and I don't know if
Yeah.
I want to. I don't know if I can.
Oh, say more about that. So what was it that was hard about making that decision, and where were you feeling vulnerable or challenged?
Oh, I mean, there were many different dimensions. I had to grapple with some of my own unskillful errors around consent throughout my developmental process. I had to go back to my earliest sexual experiences with partners at, fumbling at 13, 14, figuring out how to kiss and
Mhm.
eventually have sex with partners as I was aging and developing. And I made mistakes. And I was like, how can I write a book and be a public figure talking about consent and teaching it and knowing the mistakes I've made and the people that I've hurt in that process? Like, how can I do that in an unhypocritical way? How can I do that with integrity? How can I do that in a way so
Mm-hmm.
that if one of the people that I've hurt ever picked up my book and took a look at it, they would feel that I was honoring the pain that I caused them and not shying away from it. And so that took a huge amount of internal development to figure out how to bring that into alignment before I could really figure out how to hold that and honor it. How could I
How
include
did
it
you
in the book?
navigate that process?
Gosh, I talked a lot to other people. I talked to, first, I talked to my partners. I talked to several of my female friends about that challenge. What would help them feel honored? What would, in the sense, if one of their partners who had made errors like this was trying to do what I'm doing. I ended up talking with a couple of other men who I know work in spaces of consent violation and sexual trauma to check myself against their sense of whether I had a right at a certain level to talk about this. And I went through a process of deciding that I would give an accounting of my errors to the degree that I'm aware of them in the book. At one point it was chapter 2. In the end, the product, it ended up as an afterword, which I think works really well. And I also wanted to figure out whether and how to include the voices of the people that I hurt, and navigating questions of like, am I going to hurt people again by reaching out to them? I ended up having a female friend reach out to the people that I had hurt and invite them
Mm.
to, we engaged in, a multi-layered vetted process of like, you don't have to reach out. If you don't reach out, here's what's going to happen. So your story in any detail will not be included, but it's here. If you want more detail, you can ask. They were allowed to communicate with that female friend of mine or me if they wanted to. And so I tried to make every process around integrating those stories of my life, but also the stories of the people that I hurt, a consent-based process as well, so that I was
Yeah.
literally trying to write the book, practicing what I was preaching.
Wow, that is so powerful. And, thank you for sharing just literally the kind of like practicalities around seeking consent from the people that you write about. I know that that is an issue that comes up for almost every nonfiction writer, unless they're writing about a subject that is super removed from their personal experience. But these days, many, many, many nonfiction books, even they don't have to be a memoir, to incorporate a fair bit of personal material from the author. Readers really want that because they want to know who is talking, and
Yeah.
why you know what you know and why it matters to you. So I think that that is a beautiful model whenever you have to, when you're writing about something painful from the past and you want to be respectful and responsible, but also not necessarily just hand all your power over, or demand that the other person make your decision for you about whether or not or how to write about it. So that's amazing. I love that. Kind of reminds me a little bit of passing notes in class. You're is what we're saying. Becky, Eric has a message for you. Sorry, I'm being glib, but
Yeah.
back to the book. So at the end, you did decide to go forward with it. What was and is your hope for what this book will do in the world, and also for what it will do for you as you progress through your professional life?
So my hope for what it will do in the world is really oriented to the impact that I hope that it has on readers and on their capacity to be in relationship. I hope that a reader can pick up the book and walk through a process that helps them metabolize their pain and heal that pain in a way that reattaches their capacities for empathy, emotional relationship, compassion, and communication with their partners that will make them more skillful. I hope it makes, it's not just a part of the subtitle. Like, I literally hope it makes people's relationships stronger and creates hotter sex. I do hope, and I'm finding to my joy that people who are not men who are reading the book are having a similar experience that you had earlier in our conversation of like, I don't think I've looked at the men's experience this way
Mhm.
before. I don't think I've understood how men get turned into the perpetrators of these kinds of harm through a compassionate lens before. And so I hope that it,
Yeah.
while continuing to allow and maintain accountability for men's behavior, because that is 100% important and vital for the safety of all people, I also hope that it helps us take a next movement forward and how we talk about how to change that that behavior in a compassionate way, to call in more
Yeah.
men who are making errors as opposed to being predators. In
Yeah.
terms of what I hope that it does for me personally, you know, if I could have written this book in a cave and sent it out in the world and it could have been promoted by somebody else, I that would have been my pathway. Like, if I I would love to
Mhm.
be a cave troll writer, Um so I don't need much, honestly. I know and I understand that the way that I've begun thinking about it is I am the only best promoter of this book. I like to think of myself today as the person who didn't write this book. This other guy wrote this book. I really believe in it. He really put a lot of heart in it. I I really, really think that more people need it. And from there, it's just my job to promote it in the world. And if that means that I need to go do public speaking and I need to be on podcasts and I need to advocate for this book,
Mhm.
I accept that responsibility. That's, and it is
Mhm.
changing me in that process. And I accept that change. It's making me more fluid and comfortable being a public figure. I accept that.
Mhm. It's yeah, and we're going to get into that in a second. Actually, that's a perfect segue. I want to talk toward the end of our conversation. We're going to get into more detail about what it has looked like and what it has taken for you to actually make that leap into social media, etc. But let me ask you this for a minute about just the I think every author. No, that's not true, Maggie. Not every author. Many authors feel shy about promoting their book, and they love they love they're in it for the writing or for the generosity of their message, but the idea of being promotional sits uncomfortably with them. And I am thinking about it and imagining that that must be doubly, triply so for therapists who are traditionally sort of behind a veil, and I think that this is changing even in therapy rooms. There's more there are certain modalities or schools of thought that encourage the therapist to kind of show up as a whole person in the session with clients,
Mhm.
but certainly not every therapist practices that way. And traditionally, it was always like, you don't know any personal information about me. I am just here as a sort of a blank slate for you to sort of experience yourself against. Um,
Right.
so it must be really discomforting, to kind of like be a therapist on, thinking about how to get on social media. At the same time, social media is full of therapists right now, right? Like
Right.
Instagram famous therapists who have huge followings. So, um,
Yeah.
what what has that been like, and what do you think? I don't know quite what my question is like. how did you navigate that? But I'm also interested to hear your opinions on what obligations or boundaries are appropriate for any sort of public therapist to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great question. So for me, let's just start with, I started as a therapist. And as a therapist, I'm a relatively self-disclosing therapist. That is, I will often comfortably share at the least my identities with my clients so that they can orient me in identity space, understand where I'm coming from. And I also sometimes share my own struggles as a way of sharing, especially when I'm challenging men on things like sexual entitlement or their consent practices. Like, I will say things like, I have made mistakes too, to try to
Mhm. Mhm.
upend the power dynamic or the sense of shame that can sometimes emerge. The leap that I took as a therapist in this book and in becoming a more public figure is that I'm putting out what kinds of mistakes I've made much more clearly and much more
Yeah.
concretely. And that has been a little bit of a leap. And I actually ended up changing my consent forms for my clients coming in to try to reflect that. So I say I am on social media. I talk in my consent forms about, you can follow me if you want, but you may encounter things that will affect you. And then you may encounter things that I say as a public
Uh-huh.
figure that I don't usually say as a therapist. And
Uh-huh.
I invite you to bring the impact of that back into the therapy so that we can work on it. So I've had to in a way that I hope is responsible, some of the responsible of me. I've had to hand some of the responsibility back to my clients. If you are going to encounter me as a public figure, you may need to navigate with me and tell me how that's affecting you so that I can take that responsibility back to care for you. Um,
Mhm.
and
Yeah, that makes
largely
so
that
much
has worked
sense.
pretty
Yeah.
well so far. Yeah.
Mhm. And what
Uh,
kinds of let's ask about the boundaries then for a second. What do you think that therapists owe their clients in terms of not thinking right now about personal disclosure because that is clearly yours to decide what you will do with, but disclosure about things that they have observed in their clinical settings, stories of their clients or patients. And even if they're anonymized, like how weird would it feel for me to go on social media and see my therapist clearly telling an anecdote that is from my life? Even if nobody could trace it back to me, it might make me feel really exposed and weird. Is it okay to do that? Do you have to constantly change all the details? Should everything be made up? What what do you think is appropriate?
I think that different therapists are going to have different answers to this. And I think that that's okay. So, what's appropriate is what works best, both for the individual therapist, the type of work that they do, and the types of clients they see. For me,
Mm.
I work really well not just anonymizing details, but I work really well presenting aggregate clients. I'm not, when I
Mhm.
speak in a public forum about, my clinical work, it's always a mosaic. I'll take, this aspect
Mhm.
of that client and this aspect of that client. And, I've worked with enough clients that, any number of clients might say, oh, I wonder if he was talking about me. And also, I wasn't. I was talking about many of my clients who have had similar challenges. So that's what's
Mhm.
most comfortable for me. I would feel uncomfortable if I was speaking in a public forum and I had other than training therapists. When I'm training therapists, I use clinical vignettes, and that's a different kind of forum. But
Mhm.
if I'm, on a
Mhm.
podcast or something like that, then I would
Or
feel
even in case
uncomfortable.
studies that you use in the book, right? You're writing the case
Right.
studies into the
Even
book,
even
and that
those
is
are
really.
mosaics. Yeah. I would feel
Mhm.
uncomfortable if I was thinking of a specific client. I would never want a client to say, was this me? And for me to not be able to say, no, it might have been informed by aspects of our work, but there are many other clients who are reflected by that case. Yeah.
Right, right, right. I personally, I think it's a good thing that therapists are writing books using real examples. We learn so much by example. You know, when I hear a very vulnerable human story, whether it's a mosaic or a direct, accurate reflection of someone's personal history, there's so much kinship and recognition there. There's so much power to kind of normalize and weave us together in this human family. I think it's really powerful, and I'm awfully glad that society is kind of like coming out in the open with our feelings and our struggles. So I am all for it, Eric. You're fighting the good fight. Do it.
I hope so.
On that note, I'd love to ask you whether there's a therapist slash author who has been particularly influential to you. Professionally maybe, but really more specifically on a personal level, a book that you read that totally changed your life, or an author whose work really affected you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to 2002. Um, I had cheated on my wife twice in 1 year, one emotional, one physical.
Mm.
And I was really leveled by it. Have always thought of myself as an ethically minded and ethically oriented person. I am a very conscientious person, but these processes and those behaviors made me grapple with something that I didn't understand about myself, why I had done that, how I could do that. And what I really didn't understand was at first, how am I going to do something differently? Like, I still was feeling unsatisfied in my relationship in a number of ways. In the book Passionate
Mhm.
Marriage by David Schnarch, Schnarch, he's now passed, but his book still stands to me as just a clear crystallization of some of the principles of differentiation, the idea that I am responsible for my own feelings. I am responsible for
Mm.
meeting my needs. If I don't like something about my relationship, I can choose to leave it or I can accept it,
Mhm.
but it's my choice. And that
Mhm.
responsibility stays on my shoulder, even if I don't like the choice I've made, or even if I find the choice I've made unsatisfying. And it really, I mean, frankly, I think that really helped me grow up.
Wow, it's a wonderful endorsement. Um, uh, I'll have to look for that book. Uh, so let's now pivot into talking about what the writing process was like for you. You mentioned your sort of dawning moment where you were like, "Oh shit, I'm writing a book. I think I'm writing a
Yeah,
book." How did it
yeah,
go from there? I think you had a pretty circuitous path, right? You started
I did.
it had one form and then it took a very different form. Tell us how it evolved.
Yeah. So, the first thing that I mentioned is, I realized I was writing a book and I just put it in a drawer and I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And I went to a conference where a colleague, also who's passed, Gina Ogden, was holding a training about expanding the vision of sex therapy. And in that, she invited people to commit to carrying that work out into the world. And I was polarized in that training. I was like, oh, she's really asking for a commitment to do this. And I just felt that book inside of me say, yes, please commit right now. And I did.
Mhm.
And we went through kind of a little ritual process. And then I started talking about, okay, how do I do this? And I connected with some other authors at the conference, one of whom my colleague Joe Court connected me with an editor who was extremely nurturing, who helped me expand and just write, and I got everything out. And it was 125,000 words and 38 chapters long.
Ouch.
Which, if anybody
God,
doesn't know what,
as an
right?
editor, I need a nap. Just read it. Just read it. 25,000, 38 chapters. Oh, my friend, that is too
Right,
many.
right. So, if you're not oriented to what 125,000 words is, that's more like a long fantasy novel. This is a George R.R.
Yeah.
Martin or Robert Jordan length fantasy novel. This is not nonfiction.
It's
So,
basically two books because,
it's
it's
basically,
very common
yeah,
for a nonfiction book to be somewhere around 50,000 words. So,
right,
okay. So not a light read. Okay. So
right.
how did
And I was
it go from there?
Right. So I was also working with a man, which was really helpful because he could give me that feedback at that time of like, oh my God, this is so helpful, or this doesn't resonate at all. And so I decided I wanted a woman who was an experienced editor of feminist material, because I wanted an editor who brought different diversity lenses. At that point, I worked with a developmental editor whose praises I cannot sing enough, Marisa Solis. And she, when my first meeting with her, I felt like she was vetting me as well. And I was like, that's perfect. And she
Good. Yeah.
just was super sharp. She was like, okay, we got to get this down to 80,000. We've got to tighten this up. 38 is too many chapters. We reorganized so many of the ideas, reworked the outline, and we took many different passes. And I think by the time I brought the manuscript to Wonderwell, then it was about 86,000 words, which was much closer to normal.
Yeah.
And it had a better format at that point. So it
How
was
long did
much
your
tighter.
work with Marisa take to take it from 125,000 words down to 85 and all those passes? Was it a year? Was it almost a year longer? What?
It was probably about 18 months to 2 years. And again, partly because I was going through waves where I would hit something that I needed to work on internally. Literally, I would wake up with a nightmare in the middle of the night, and I'd have to go in and I'd be like, I know that we're trying to cut it down, but I've got a new section that I have to write because my ethics will not let me write this book without including it. And so, then I'd write 3,000 words, and she'd help me trim that back down to 1,200. And we didn't find the place to include it and something else to cut so that it was allowed. And
Right.
yeah. So it was a huge back and forth process.
It's a long process. And Eric, I think it's really helpful for, aspiring authors, other therapists who are like you, wanting to approach this in an incredibly conscientious and authentic way. I think it's important for people to really hear just that this is not something, it wasn't that you just went, oh, look, I have 15 blog posts. I'm just going to collect them into a, sort of one document and then poof, there's my book. It's like, oh, no. Like that's not it. It takes a lot more time and thoughtfulness.
Yeah. If you are trying to heal something in this culture with your book, you will have to take time to go slow with it for the wisdom of that healing to emerge. At least that's my experience.
I think that is, those are really wise words. Yeah, really, really, really important. I think that today we hear a lot of encouragement. We're in such an instant gratification society, and publishing having changed so much with the advent of self-publishing and, and now AI and all kinds of things. There's sort of like, there's messaging out there that this should be quick and easy. And, as a book editor and a publisher, I think that is not how really impactful books are made. And so it's great to hear your account of that. What about your writing routine itself? How did you, because you're not a professional writer, you're normally in conversation with people. So how did you actually get the words out?
Yeah, two different ways. Sometimes I could go through phases where I'd be at the end of my workday and I would just tell my family, "Hey, I've got to write tonight." You know, uh, who, we have a routine each day of the week whose responsibility is to cook. I'd say either, if it's my night, I'm going to cook, but then I'm going to go back into the office. Or if it wasn't, I'd just say, would it be all right tonight if I went into the office? And one of the hidden aspects of this process, I was in a creative writing magnet high school, which used, is it Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones
Yeah.
free writing
Yeah. Yeah.
process? And so
That's how
I
you wound up with
have,
125,000 words, by the way.
right. So because I was trained in that tradition of creative writing, I can sit and write. And I don't experience that other process that some people have of like, what am I going to say? So
Mhm.
the first way that I'm mentioning is I could sit and just write at the end of the day if I was in one of those phases. If I wasn't in one of those phases, it wasn't going to happen. I was doing internal work, I was doing my therapy, I was going for walks, and I was thinking about the book. And the other thing that I did is I set writers retreats for myself. I got cabins on the coast and I was alone and
Mm.
I would literally write 10 hours a day and just, sit and eat and go back to the table and write. And I went through these bursts where I wrote huge portions of the book in, I think I did two of those and I mean, I probably wrote 60,000 words over 2 weeks of just sitting.
Wow. Wow, that's impressive, and it's also important to note that not everybody is built that way, and
Right.
so
Yeah,
it's.
no,
I'm
that's
always interested to hear. Actually, you mentioned Lori Mintz earlier in our conversation. I've actually interviewed her too on this podcast, and if you're listening, you should go check out that episode. Lori Mintz is an amazing therapist and author of Becoming Cliterate and other books. But she talked about how she has the capacity to sit and write for 7 hours at a stretch, and some people even kind of career authors, career writers, that's just not their rhythm. So I think that the what I have gleaned over the years is just that it's not about um, asking people what the best way is and then forcing yourself to do that best way. It
right.
is really about understanding how your own writing body works and then listening
Right.
to it and
Well,
respecting
yeah, and
it.
I hope nobody compares themselves to that in a negative way, right? Because at the same time, I also went through, 6 month stretches where I'd be avoiding one or the other of my editor being like, yeah, yeah, I'll send you something soon. And, I have my own places where things stalled for sure. And
Yeah, and but
we
I
all,
think I mean you're a therapist, and so you have a very embracing kind of perspective on people's emotional and sexual lives. I'm a book editor and publisher. I have a very embracing perspective
yeah,
on writers' processes, and so I
that's fair.
really know that um, uh, sitting binge writing is great if that's great for you. Taking long spells away from the book and just needing to do your inner work and go for walks is great if that's what you need. And being a steady Eddie who just wants to chip away at it with 20 minutes in the morning, but really, really consistently, that's also great. They're all great.
Yeah. The other thing, for what it's worth, is that I also kept track of my word count. At the end of every day of writing, I put it in a spreadsheet just so that I could see that I was making progress.
I love that. Little motivators. Yeah. I like to give myself chocolate covered almonds after I've hit a writing milestone.
Nice.
Let's go back to what we were talking about around going public and being on social media or on podcasts like this one. Um, what has it, what has it, what has it kind of cost you to make that shift emotionally or otherwise? And what have you gained from it?
The costs. are not as great as I feared. The costs really are about time. Um, I need to go. When I realized that I could record my videos on walks, that really helped, because when I thought I needed to like set up in my office like a studio, um, that made it harder to produce content. But when I realized that I could
Mm-hmm.
produce content while I was on my walks, then it wasn't taking those walks away. So that was very good. Um, and the other thing is that it has reduced my weekly caseload a little bit. I've had to
Mm.
just throttle back a tiny bit, probably just 3 or 4 clients a week from where I was, so that I had a little more time in my week to produce, edit, and publish social media content for promotion.
Mm.
What have I
Mm.
gained? I mean, I think a lot more confidence in my message. I've realized that
Mm.
I have a lot more content that I'm producing in the process. Some of it is directly out of the book, but I've also been able to take parts of the book that needed to get squeezed down, and I get in the social media process to expand that back out for people who are following me. So, all those babies that ended up cut on the editing room floor, you know, not all of them are getting put back in, but I get to expand a little bit more. And the other thing that I really love is having more of a dialogue. So when people reply, when colleagues, clients, or friends say, "Oh, I saw that video, let's talk about that." When people on social media are asking follow-up questions, it feels like a richer conversation, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I love that account, Eric, because I think a lot of people, especially as I said, if you're a very introverted person by nature, or if your work means that you're used to being quite private, it can feel like, oh, this is so self-promotional. I'm grabbing at attention, and what you're describing is what I know as a person who works to help authors market their books, is that when it's done authentically, book promotion really expands your connection to other people who either are or will become your readers, expands your connection and puts you into a dialogue space with the very people who you care the most about, who you are writing this book for. And so it's the very antithesis of a selfish activity. But how wonderful that was. Do you feel that you talked about like kind of getting over your shyness? Do you feel more, I suppose, confident in being a spokesperson, even if it's just a spokesperson for your own book?
No, maybe I don't know that I do. I, uh, I am more confident in the sense that I know that I can produce the content, and I feel a lot more comfortable now. I've been producing Monday through Friday content since late April, so I'm about 6 months in, and I'm much more confident that I
Yeah.
can do that. In a timely manner, that my message is going to be on point. I'm a lot less scared now that I'm going to say something that misses some element of the ethos. I've also got a large enough body
Hmm.
of content that I can say, yes, I know I'm not talking about this here, but I talked about there. So I'm feeling a lot more confident in that way. I don't know that I would still say that it's comfortable for me. It's still a stretch
Interesting.
for me,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
in the sense,
Yeah.
if you know my fantasy would be that the book is just suddenly out there in the world and it just takes
Yeah.
off, and I don't have to do the social media stuff anymore. I'll say the surprising thing is that I like and am comfortable and confident doing podcasts. That is the intuitive, more like
Okay.
one-on-one dialogue for me as a therapist. That fits. It's a really good fit for me. And so I've tried to do that as often as possible.
Well, going back to what you said earlier about also just approaching this as sort of like you're just a proxy or a spokesperson for that other guy who wrote this amazing book that you really believe in. And that is a really cool Jedi mind trick that I will have to, recommend to others who are struggling with being out there in front of the curtain with in front of their own work.
Yeah.
Eric, it has been such a delight talking with you about your process and about your work in the world. Are there any final words that you want to leave our listeners with, particularly those who are considering embarking on a journey like the one that you're on, from therapist to author?
I've said this in other forums in different ways, but as you are trying to spread the seed of whatever healing wisdom you have, the benefit that you feel that you have to offer, I just want to encourage you to protect the source of that seed. You are spreading that. Make sure that you protect the source while you are offering it to the world.
Beautiful. Oh, thank you so much. Well, this has been a delight. Eric, where can people find you? I know you're on Instagram. Can you share your handles? You're on TikTok too, right?
I'm on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, Threads, everywhere. At Dr. Eric Fitz, DrEricFitz, and that's also my website, drericfitz.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really fun and a rich conversation.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.